Hi, I'm Cindy Stacer, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Rusty Blackbird population and its habitat in Nova Scotia. First, I will review the status of the Rusty Blackbird population in Nova Scotia, and then I'm going to talk to you about three projects I've worked on with my students to address the following questions. First, are past sites occupied by this species still occupied, and can we explain why certain sites are still occupied? What characterizes the Rusty Blackbird habitat at the site level? And what habitat features are these birds selecting at larger scales? And before I move on, I'll just tell you that this is a picture of a Rusty Blackbird home range in Cape Breton. It was nesting in these trees here, and it used this entire wetland. And you can see that there's been a huge amount of harvesting in the landscape around it. So the Rusty Blackbird is listed as endangered in Nova Scotia under the Nova Scotia Endangered Species Act. Under the federal protection, it's listed as special concern by the Species at Risk Act and by COSIWIC. If you look over on the right side, you can see a graph of trends from the breeding bird survey data. Nova Scotia is combined with Prince Edward Island here because there are so few routes on the island. This is part of the Atlantic Northern Forest, or BCR 14, and population change since 1970 has been negative 95%. But the species is not well sampled by the breeding bird survey and has become less and less well sampled, obviously, since it has been declining so much. So I looked at the breeding bird survey data for Nova Scotia and PEI for since 1997, and the number of routes run in Nova Scotia per year averaged 22.6, and in PEI only 3. And I looked at the number of routes that had detections of Rusty Blackbirds on them, and it sort of broke down into two groups of years. Between 1997 and 2002, about 13% of the routes had at least one Rusty Blackbird. Mostly a route would have only one, but sometimes there was more than one. And between 2003 and 2017, this declined to 4% of the routes that had Rusty Blackbirds. So another a line of evidence for the population status in Nova Scotia is the breeding bird atlases that are done. Our atlas is run over 3 maritime provinces, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. The first was in 1986 to 1990, and the second in 2006 to 2010. The color dots are places where Rusty Blackbirds were found. The darker the color, the more certain the breeding evidence. And here, colors are the same, but you'll see little black dots, which means Rusty Blackbirds could not be found in those squares where they were found previously, and the little white dots were places where they had been found that weren't found previously. Now, the species became listed during the second atlas, early in the second atlas. So people were, this marks the first time that people were really recording exact locations for birds. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to go back to those sites and see, are the birds still there? And we between 2013 and 2019, we visited as many of these sites as we could. We used playback to increase the likelihood of detection. We enlisted the help of volunteers to cover the province, and altogether we surveyed 56% of the 93 sites. And so the question we wanted to ask is, what is the persistence rate, and can it be explain. So persistence was the percent of sites still occupied. So we found Rusty Blackbirds at 38% of the previously occupied sites that we were able to visit. We did notice some regional differences with higher persistence in southwest Nova Scotia. So that's everything here, basically west of this blue line. 52% versus 29% for the rest of the province. I need to do more work on this to see whether this is a true effect or whether there may be some biases in the data, because we did spend more time in southwest Nova Scotia. In terms of breeding evidence, it didn't seem like sites that were where birds were found, the persistent sites, had different levels of breeding evidence than the other sites. Habitat disturbance was sort of the hypothesis for why birds may have disappeared from certain sites. So we analyzed this by using visual analysis of satellite imagery from Google Earth or Land Viewer. And so we're looking at the amount of the area where there had been additional harvesting or additional roads put in. We selected images closest in time to the two survey dates, basically the breeding bird atlas date and then our resurvey date. And then we compared the sites where the Rusty Blackbirds were found and where they weren't at two scales. At the home range scale, so this is the home range scale here. This is one of the Rusty Blackbirds we found in 2013. So the home range scale is 60 hectares and the landscape scale is 5 kilometer radius. So did persistent sites have less habitat disturbance? Well, there's a bit of a suggestion that this might be the case, so I'll just present sort of what the trends that we're looking at, but I'm not sure that they're probably not statistically significant. Sites where birds were persistent there were fewer of those sites had harvesting in the home range buffer and in the landscape buffer. They had somewhat less of the home range buffer harvested, and the distance to the nearest new road in the home range and the distance to the nearest new harvest in the landscape buffer was farther in persistent sites. But I think we have a lot more work to do on this, and we haven't analyzed the GIS data. However, the GIS data are all from the same time period, but we'll be able to at least compare those in more detail. So now we want to look at the site habitat at the site level. So these are examples of some of the breeding sites in Nova Scotia. Picture on the left here, there was a nest site in this black spruce here. And this was on the very edge of this rather large bog. These are two sites around where birds were nesting somewhere in the vicinity of these two beaver ponds. And this is that clump of trees where the birds were nesting in that picture that I showed you on the second slide in Cape Breton. What characterizes Rusty Blackbird habitat at the site level? To answer this question, we measured forest structure and composition along a 50-meter transect at 73 sites. Most of these were in forested wetlands. There were also included sites where Canada warblers and olive-sided flycatchers were. Measured a number of variables. 13 of the sites had Rusty Blackbirds, and these spanned a wide range of forest stand types and wetland types, but most were wet coniferous or wet mixed with vegetation types. In terms of forest or wetland type, they were coniferous treed swamps and mixed with tall shrub swamps. Only a few of these sites were known nest sites, but they were sites where we found the birds. So we found that the sites with Rusty Blackbirds had significantly more exposed shallow water. less low shrub cover, that's below 2 meters. There was less conifer cover in the low shrub layer, and there were shorter conifers in the low shrub layer. What about at larger scales? What habitat features are Rusty Blackbirds selecting? To answer this question, we used 3 sets of data. We had the presence sites from field surveys. We had 40 sites, absent sites from field surveys. I'll tell you right now that we found no difference between those two. And then we also had, we set a 1 square kilometer fishnet grid across the province, which gave us over 62,000 points. And this is just an example of one site. And so this is this 60 hectare buffer, which approximates the size of a home range that we've observed in Nova Scotia. And then we compared data from the GIS layers for the fishnet grid to the present sites. And this is just a list of all the variables we compared. We used wetness information, water information, stream length, portion of the area covered by water bodies, road length we used as a measure of human disturbance, and lots of information from the forest inventory data, including all of the different tree species. So what did we find? Compared to the fishnet grid sites that were systematically put across the province, sites with Rusty Blackbirds had significantly more wet land. So this is land where the water table is less than 0.5 meters from the surface, and that's from a wet areas mapping predictive layer. More streams, but not more lakes. More roads. It's probably a sampling artifact because most of the places that had Rusty Blackbirds where people had encountered them were relatively close to a road. There was more canopy cover of balsam fir and intolerant hardwood, but not more spruce. And the second story below the main canopy was taller and had and was more closed, but not. Rusty Blackbird sites did not have more closed canopies of the main canopy or taller trees, and they did not have more conifer cover or more conifer basal area. So in conclusion, visual analysis of the satellite imagery suggests persistence might be influenced by habitat disturbance and may differ by region. This requires more work, and we still need to analyze the corresponding GIS data. At the site level, Rusty Blackbirds mostly occupied wet coniferous and mixed wood forest, treed and tall shrub swamps, with more shallow water, less vegetation cover under 2 meters. So basically, much more open than the other 2 species we were looking at. At larger scales, Rusty Blackbirds selected habitats with more wet land, better developed second story, and more balsam fir and intolerant hardwoods, and more streams. And that leads me to mention that in Nova Scotia, regulations require forested buffers to 20 meters wide on streams. And this likely provides really important habitat for Rusty Blackbird foraging and movement through their home range. However, currently there are no buffers required around wetlands in Nova Scotia. I'd like to thank many people and organizations for contributing to this work, as well as the steering committee for organizing this symposium. And I'd like to invite you all to the Rusty Blackbird workshop that we're going to have next week. See the website to register. Thank you very much for your attention.